The sign on the door said "Close by order of the Stony Falls School Board," and the padlock beneath it was not a small one. Ada Colburn read the notice twice, the way she always read things she didn't want to believe, not because she expected the words to change, but because she respected accuracy enough to verify it before reacting. The notice was dated 11 days ago. The padlock was new. She had been on a train for 4 days. Before that, a ferry from Halifax. Before that, the conversation with Headmistress Drumbridge in the front office of Whitmore Ladies' Academy that had ended her position, her income, and her future in Nova Scotia in the space of approximately 8 minutes. She set her smaller trunk down in the mud beside the school steps. It was raining. Ada Colburn was 28 years old. She had $32.40 to her name, a letter of appointment from a Mr. Henry Marsh of the Stony Falls School Board that she had since established was 3 months out of date, and 2 trunks, one filled with teaching materials and one filled with everything she owned. She had counted the money 3 times on the train and once more at the station, not because she enjoyed the exercise, but because her mother had taught her that when everything falls apart around you, the first sensible thing to do is establish precisely what remains. What remained? $32.40. A wool coat that was doing its best in the October rain, 3 changes of practical clothing, a box of chalk, every book she had ever considered too important to sell. What did not remain? A position, a roof, any certainty about the next 24 hours. She looked at the padlock. She looked at the road that ran through Stony Falls, Alberta, 2 streets wide, and entirely unimpressed with her presence. A few faces had looked up when she came through on the wagon from the station, but they had looked away with the particular incuriosity of people who had already classified her as someone else's concern. She picked up her smaller trunk and walked toward the building with a light in its window. The general store was called Spratt's, which told Ada nothing about the owner, and everything about the fact that somebody in this town had been here long enough to name things. The bell above the door announced her with the cheerful indifference of a bell that didn't know what kind of day she was having. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 60, with gray hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped negotiating with it years ago, and eyes that took Ada in from boots to hat brim with a thoroughness that was not unkind, but was certainly complete. "You're the new teacher," the woman said. It was not a question. "I was going to be," Ada said. "The school appears to be closed." The woman's expression did the specific thing that expressions do when they're confirming something already known rather than receiving news. "Doris Spratt," she said, extending her hand across the counter. Come in out of that rain properly. You'll want to know what happened to the school." Ada came in. She removed her hat, which was past saving. "Ada Colburn," she said, "and yes, I would." Doris Spratt made tea without asking whether Ada wanted any, which Ada had already decided was the correct approach. She set 2 cups on the counter and folded her hands in the manner of a woman who dealt in facts and saw no reason to delay them. "Malcolm Steed closed it," she said. "Steed runs cattle on most of the land north of town, and he's had his eye on the school property since the spring. He told the board the building was structurally unsound, which it isn't. I've been inside it twice since May, and the floors are perfectly fine, and that it needed to be condemned. The board voted to close pending inspection. The inspector hasn't come. Steed's second cousin sits on the board." Ada wrapped her hands around the cup. "And the children?" "Going without since July." "How many?" 14 of school age, 3 more coming up." Ada thought about 14 children and 3 months without school and a padlock on a building that wasn't structurally unsound. She thought about it the way she thought about most problems, by locating the specific hinge point. Every problem had one. "Who holds the property records for the school?" she said. Doris Spratt paused in a way that meant something. "County office in Drumheller," she said slowly. "Why?" "Because if Steed's claim about structural unsoundness isn't in the official records, and if the board's vote was conducted without proper process, the closure may not be legally enforceable." Ada set down her cup. "I kept records for Whitmore Academy in Halifax for 2 years while their administrative secretary was ill. I know what proper process looks like. I'd like to see the board's minutes." Doris Spratt looked at her for a moment, across the tea and the rain on the window. "You've been in town 20 minutes, she said. "I know," Ada said. "Is that a problem?" Something in Doris Spratt's face settled. Not quite a smile, but the particular expression of a woman who has been hoping for a specific thing and has just identified it. "The minutes are a matter of public record," she said. "My nephew is the board secretary. He's not especially proud of the vote. I'd like to speak with him. I'll send for him tonight." The door opened, and a man came in out of the rain with the particular purposefulness of someone who was there for a reason and not stopping long. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with the build of a man accustomed to covering distances. Not heavy, but solid in the way of someone who had learned to rely on his own constitution. His coat was the coat of someone who had gotten wet doing his actual work, rather than standing in front of a closed school. He stopped when he saw Ada in a way that wasn't stopping for her benefit, but simply the natural hesitation of someone who hadn't expected a stranger at the counter. "Bennett," Doris said. "This is Ada Colburn. She was hired as the new teacher. She's just arrived to find the school padlocked." The man, Bennett, looked at Ada with the directness of someone who didn't waste time on intermediate expressions. It was not pity, and it was not curiosity, and it was not the particularly weighted look Ada had learned to watch for in men who considered a woman alone a fact worth cataloging for their own purposes. It was something more like assessment. The kind a person does when they're deciding whether to be useful. "Bennett Hale," he said. "I'm the doctor here, circuit practice, mostly." He looked at Doris. "I saw the supply wagon from the station. Figured someone new had come in." "She was sitting in front of the school," Doris said. "In the rain." "The school was closed," Ada said, because she preferred accuracy to narrative embellishment. Something shifted in his expression. "I know it was," he said quietly, and in the quietness she heard a specific quality. Not embarrassment, not guilt, but the subdued quality of a man who had watched something wrong happen and had been unable to stop it. "Is there a boarding house?" Ada asked. "Somewhere I can stay tonight while I find my footing." "Their apprentice rents rooms on the east side," Doris said. "Clean, fair rates." "I can carry the trunk from the station," Bennett said. He didn't offer it as a favor. He said it the way a person states an available fact. "Here is a thing that can happen." Ada thought about the trunk, which was heavy, and the rain, which was continuing, and the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. "Thank you," she said. "I'll accept." Vera Prentice's boarding house had 3 rooms available and a landlady who communicated primarily through pointed glances and the strategic placement of additional blankets. Ada had a room with a window facing west and a lock on the door, and she considered both of these facts sufficient. She lay awake that first night making the kind of list her mother had always prescribed for moments of collapse, not what she had lost. The position at Whitmore, the reference Drumbridge would certainly withhold, the reasonable expectation of arriving somewhere and finding what she'd been promised. Not what she needed, a salary, a permanent position, a way forward that didn't depend on strangers. What she actually had right now in this exact moment, $32.40. Her qualifications, which were real and documented, 14 children who hadn't had a teacher since July, a school board vote that might not be procedurally sound, a woman named Doris Spratt who seemed to know where the levers were, a problem with a hinge point she hadn't fully located yet. She added one more item before she slept, a town that hadn't decided what to think of her yet. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the most important thing on the list. Doris's nephew was named Peter Quill, and he was 35 and guilty in the specific way of someone who had gone along with something he knew was wrong, and hadn't yet found a way to square it with himself. He sat across from Ada in Doris's back room on the second morning, and laid the board minutes on the table with the careful movements of a man setting down something fragile. Ada read them twice. The motion to close was moved by Alderman Steed's cousin, she said, Harold Steed, and the second was from Raymond Fitch, Steed's business partner in the cattle operation. She set the pages down. 2 of the 5 votes came from men with a direct financial interest in the outcome. In Nova Scotia, that would constitute a conflict of interest sufficient to invalidate the vote. I'd like to know if Alberta's municipal ordinances differ substantially. He blinked. In Drumheller, at the county office. Can you get them? The pause of a man calculating the cost of doing the right thing against the cost of continuing not to. I can go Thursday, he said. The children have been studying from whatever their parents had at home, he added, before she could respond. Mrs. Hartling's been reading to the younger ones out of an almanac. Ada thought about children studying from almanacs. She thought about it precisely long enough to decide what she was going to do next. "Tell Mrs. Hartling," she said, "that I'll be starting informal instruction in this back room on Monday morning, 8 o'clock, no charge." Doris, who had been making a show of organizing her shelf inventory during this conversation, set down a tin of biscuits with a small, satisfied sound. 14 children came on Monday. 2 more came on Wednesday when word got out. Ada taught from her own books and from what she could borrow, and she wrote lessons on a salvaged piece of board with her chalk, and the back room of Spratt's general store became, within the span of a week, the most organized 10 feet of educational space in Stony Falls, Alberta. Bennett Hale came by on the second Thursday, not as a student, though Ada noticed that he listened to the afternoon grammar lesson with the attention of someone who found the topic genuinely interesting. After the children had gone, she told him he didn't have to stand in the doorway, and he came in and looked at the board she'd covered in the day's work. "You're doing this without pay," he said. "I'm doing this because it needs doing," she said. "The pay question resolves itself once the closure is dealt with." He looked at the board. "The structural report Steed used to justify the closure," he said. "Did you see it?" "It was referenced in the minutes. I haven't seen the actual document." "I have." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, a careful man's notation, precise block letters. Steed showed it around last spring, trying to build support. The inspector's name was listed as a Daich Forest out of Calgary. The letterhead address didn't look right to me, so I wrote it down. When I went to Calgary in August, I looked it up. W.H. Forrest, structural inspector, dissolved his practice in 1889, 2 years before this report was supposedly written. Ada took the paper. She read it twice. "He used a defunct inspector's credentials," she said. "It looks that way." She looked up at him. He was watching her with the same straight, attentive expression he'd had the first afternoon in the rain, waiting to see what she'd do with the thing, rather than telling her what to do with it. "This changes the board's legal exposure considerably," she said. "A fraudulent structural report submitted to a municipal board is not a procedural question. It's a criminal one." "I know," he said. "How long have you had this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Since August." "And you didn't act on it?" He met her gaze steadily. "I didn't know what to do with it," he said. "I'm a doctor. I know what to do with a fracture or a fever. I didn't know how to turn a paper into something that would actually change what Steed had done." He paused. "I know now, because you're here." Ada set the paper down on her teaching board. She thought about the children who had studied from almanacs for 3 months. She thought about Bennett Hale carrying this piece of information through the summer, alone with it, not knowing what to do with it. She thought about the specific loneliness of that, of having evidence of a wrong thing and no means to act on it. "You should have found someone to help you sooner," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you now." It was the right thing to say. She could tell by the quality of it. No deflection, no qualification, just acknowledgement. She had not had much practice with that kind of directness from a man, and she found she didn't know quite what to do with it, except to receive it as it was offered. "All right," she said. "Help me draft the formal objection." They worked at Doris's back table until the lamp was low, and by the end of it they had a 3-page document that laid out, in plain and methodical language, the conflict of interest in the board vote and the fraudulent credentials of the structural report. Ada had written for precision. Bennett had read for gaps and found 2 she'd missed. Between them, it was thorough in the way a thing needs to be when the opposition has money and the benefit of a long head start. The letter arrived from Halifax on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Ada had come to Stony Falls. She heard about it from Doris before she'd finished breakfast, which was how she'd come to understand information moved in this town. Through Doris first, then outward to the appropriate people. The letter was addressed to the Stony Falls School Board and had come from Headmistress Esther Drumbridge of Whitmore Ladies' Academy. It stated, in the careful language of someone who had practiced saying a thing without technically lying, that Ada Colburn had been released from her position at Whitmore following concerns about her professional conduct, and that the board might wish to reconsider their appointment. Ada sat with her tea and read the copy Peter Quill brought her. She didn't specify the conduct, Ada said. No, Peter said, just concerns. That's deliberate. Unspecified concerns are harder to disprove than specific ones. She knows that. What actually happened? Doris asked, with the directness Ada had come to understand was simply her way. Not intrusive, just unwilling to work around things that could be worked through. Ada told them. She told them about Lawrence Baxter Jr., whose father owned the academy and whose marks Ada had been asked to improve by 15% on the final term reports. She told them she had refused and documented the request in writing. She told them that 2 weeks later she was called into Drumbridge's office and informed her contract would not be renewed, and that the reason given was restructuring. She had kept the written request. She had kept her copy of the original marks. She had kept the termination letter, which made no mention of conduct. I have all of it, she said, in my trunk. Doris and Peter exchanged a look. Can we see it? Peter said. Yes, Ada said. That's exactly what I'd like you to see. Bennett helped organize the meeting for Thursday evening. Not a formal board session, but a gathering of concerned townspeople in the church hall, because the church hall was the largest interior space in Stony Falls, and Doris had arranged it with the focused efficiency of a woman who had made this kind of thing happen before. Ada stood at the front of the room with her documents on the table beside her, and looked at the people who had shown up, which was most of the town. She had been there less than a month. She knew their names now, most of them, and their children's names, and in many cases what problems they'd brought to Bennett, and whether he'd been able to help. She told them the same thing she'd told Doris and Peter, and she showed them the same documents, and she told them what Drumbridge's letter was, and why it had been written. I left Halifax, she said, because I refused to pass a student who hadn't earned it. That's the whole of my conduct in question. The person who asked me to falsify the records works for the family that owns the school. The person who terminated my employment works for the same family. The letter you received is from a woman protecting a position she cannot afford to lose. She looked at the room. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. The documents are available for anyone who wants to read them. There was a silence of the specific kind that settles over a room when something true has been said in full. Then Dorothy Hartling, who had been reading her children from an almanac all summer, stood up. She's been teaching my children for 3 weeks, she said. She came here with nothing and started a school in a storage room. That's what I know about her conduct. Doris Spratt stood up. The school board vote was made with undeclared conflicts of interest by men who stood to profit from the closure. The structural report was fraudulent. The formal objection has been filed with the county. That's what I know about the closure. Bennett stood up last. He said nothing for a moment, and the room waited for him the way rooms wait for people who don't speak often, but mean it when they do. I've been in this town for 6 years, he said. I've been carrying around a piece of paper since August that I didn't know how to use. Ada Colburn's been here 3 weeks, and she turned it into a legal filing. He looked at her with the straight, unhurried attention she'd come to recognize. I think we know what kind of person she is. Reverend Bouchard, who was perhaps 75 and had said nothing until now, cleared his throat with the authority of a man who had been in this building longer than anyone else in it. It seems to me, he said in a voice that carried without effort, that we've heard from Miss Colburn, and we've heard from her neighbors, and we've heard what we need to hear. Does anyone have something to add that changes the substance? No one did. The county's response to the formal objection arrived 5 weeks later. The vote was declared voidable on grounds of undeclared conflict of interest. The fraudulent structural report was referred to the provincial authority. Malcolm Steed did not come to the church hall or the general store or anywhere Ada was likely to be, and she took this as the confirmation it was. A man who had lost the ground under his strategy and was deciding how far back to step. Ada received the news on a Friday morning from Peter Quill, who had ridden to Drumheller and back in 2 days with the particular determination of a man who had decided that doing the right thing belatedly was still doing the right thing. She sat in Doris's back room for a while after he left. The teaching supplies were stacked neatly against the wall. The actual school building, 2 streets away, with its proper windows and its perfectly sound floors, would reopen as soon as the padlock was removed. She had already written a curriculum through to spring. Bennett came by in the afternoon. He had the habit of arriving at the end of the day when there was something on his mind which she had learned to recognize as a form of communication, not avoidance, just the preference of a man who thought better when the day's work was behind him. "It's done," she said before he sat down. He looked at her face the way he looked at most things, for the actual information rather than the surface of it. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like I've been holding my breath since Halifax," she said, "and I've just remembered how to breathe properly." He nodded. "The school board is meeting next week to formalize the reopening," he said. "Doris already has 3 people lined up to repaint the front steps." "Doris had them lined up before the county responded," Ada said. Something in his face did the thing she'd noticed before. Not quite a smile, but in the near vicinity of one, the expression of a man who finds something genuinely worth appreciating and doesn't feel the need to perform the appreciation. They sat in the comfortable quiet that had developed between them over weeks of working at the same table. The quiet of people who have run out of things they need to prove to each other and can simply be in the same room without filling it. "I got a letter from Baxter's family solicitor," Ada said. "They're not pursuing anything formally. The documentation I have is apparently sufficient deterrent." Bennett looked at her. "You expected that?" "I hoped for it," she said. "There's a difference." He leaned forward slightly. "Ada." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about something," he said with the preamble of a man who has been organizing a thought for longer than the present conversation. "I've been in Stony Falls for 6 years, and for most of that time this town has been a place I work. Good work, I mean that. But it's been a place I work." He paused. "It's not that anymore, and I think you know it isn't." The back room of Spratt's general store was very quiet. Outside, Doris could be heard explaining something to a customer with her characteristic blend of authority and goodwill. "That's not a question," Ada said. "No," he said. "It's not. I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you what's true, and you can do with it whatever you decide." She sat with that for a moment. The way he said it, completely, without placing a demand on her response, was itself an answer to a question she had carried from Halifax without entirely knowing she was carrying it. The question of what it looks like when a man says something and means it without needing a particular answer back. "I came here with 2 trunks and no job," she said. "I've been in this town 7 weeks. I've built something. My classroom, my standing, my name here. That's mine." "I know it is," he said immediately. "I watched you build it." She looked at him across the table, at the face she'd been reading for 7 weeks, and could now read the way she read a complicated text, for what it was carrying beneath the surface and for what it held steady under pressure. "The school reopens in 3 weeks," she said. "Come to the first day." Something in him settled. Not the settlement of getting what he'd wanted, but the settlement of a thing landing in the right place, the way a correct answer feels different from a good guess. "I'll be there," he said. The school reopened on a Wednesday in November, with the front steps freshly painted and 14 children inside, and 3 more starting the following week. Doris had organized the repainting and the supply of new chalk and 2 replacement readers ordered from Calgary, which she received as a personal vindication when they arrived 2 days early. Bennett was there in the back row, in the good coat he wore when things mattered. Ada stood at the front of the room that was hers and looked at the children, who were finally where they belonged, and felt the particular fullness of a life that is being genuinely lived rather than managed from a distance. In March, Bennett asked her to marry him. He did it at Doris's back table after everyone had gone, with the last of the lamplight and the kind of directness that had become the only language between them that worked. He told her the town was different because she was in it. He told her he was not a man who said things to fill silences, and that when he said he wanted to spend the rest of his life knowing her, it was not a thing he had said lightly or would say to anyone else. Ada looked at her classroom across the hall, at the chalk and the readers and the names on the attendance register, at the work that was unambiguously hers. "The classroom stays," she said. He looked at her without surprise, the look of a man who had anticipated this and considered it correct. "The classroom stays," he said. "And I keep my name on the board, Miss Colburn, not Mrs. Hale, for the children. This is my school." "It is," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had brought her evidence in the rain, and worked late at her table, and stood up in a church hall and said what he meant without needing an audience for the meaning. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He almost smiled, and she almost smiled, and neither of them said anything else for a moment, because there was nothing else to say that the room wasn't already holding. They married in April, when the snow had retreated to the upper slopes of the Rockies, and Stony Falls had arrived at that brief particular window of Alberta spring that feels like being forgiven for the winter. Reverend Bouchard performed the ceremony in the same church hall where Ada had stood and told the truth about herself to strangers who had become neighbors. Dorothy Hartling brought her children, who sat in the front row with the solemn attention of children at an occasion they understand to be significant. Doris Spratt wore her good brooch and cried without apology. Ada wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she'd ordered from Calgary, not because she couldn't have borrowed, but because she had wanted something made entirely to her own specifications, and the making of it had told her something about herself she had not fully articulated until she put it on, that she was a person who knew what she needed and had learned to provide it. Her younger brother Arthur had come from Halifax. He had taken 3 trains and arrived the night before, road-worn and slightly overwhelmed by Alberta, and he had sat across from her at Vera Prentice's breakfast table and said, "You look like yourself. More than you did at home, I think," which was the truest thing anyone had said about her in a long time, and which had required the rest of her tea to manage properly. Ada Colburn Hale. She kept both names, used them by context, and no one in Stony Falls found this remarkable because they had stopped trying to put her into a single category weeks before the wedding, taught school Monday through Friday, and kept Bennett's medical records on Saturday mornings, because his system for paperwork was, as she had observed in her first week of looking at it, a well-intentioned disaster. She rode to the school each morning on the gray gelding she'd bought from the Hartling farm in December, along the road that ran through the center of Stony Falls, and past Doris Spratt's front window, from which Doris invariably watched with the expression of a woman whose confidence in a situation has been fully and permanently validated. The children grew. 3 more enrolled in the spring. She was grading papers on a Tuesday afternoon in September, the good, focused kind of work that required the mind to be exactly where the hands were. When Bennett came in from his rounds, took off his coat, and sat down across from her at the kitchen table, with the ease of a man on his own ground who was also unmistakably on hers. "How are the papers?" he said. "Ada McLean is going to be a mathematician," Ada said. "She's solved every problem I've given her and added her own notation for efficiency. She's 9 years old." He poured himself a cup of tea from the pot she'd left on the stove and looked at her across the table with the unhurried attention. That was simply how he looked at things that mattered. "Good day," he said. "Good day," she said, and meant it in the full way, the way that counts. Outside, the first suggestion of autumn was coming off the Rockies. Not the brutal cold yet, but its preliminary announcement. The particular quality of September light that Alberta uses to tell you winter is forming its intentions. Ada had not grown up with this sky. She had not expected to find it beautiful. She had revised that expectation thoroughly and without regret. She picked up her pen and went back to the papers, and Bennett went back to his reading, and the house was quiet in the way that is not empty but full. The way a life is quiet when it has been built on real ground, on honest work and known people, and choices made with open eyes. She had arrived in Stony Falls with 2 trunks, $32, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who will not be defined by what others decide she is worth. On a road outside a padlocked school, in October rain, she had counted what she had and decided it was enough to begin. Everything that came after, the school, the classroom, the town that knew her name and had stood up when it mattered, the man across the table who told the truth and waited while she decided what to do with it, had grown from that beginning the way real things grow, slowly, without announcement, from the ground up. She had never been lost here. She had been, from the first day, exactly where she was building toward.